Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm Dr. Lekhwani, and in this video, I'll be breaking down the finances and costs associated with being a pre-medical student applying to and attending medical school in Canada and in the US. These are the topics that I'll be discussing in more detail in this video. So let's talk about undergrad. Most med schools in Canada require that you finish at least 3 years of a bachelor's degree, with US schools often requiring a complete bachelor's degree by the time you start med school. For a bachelor's degree in science in Canada, you can expect a cost of around $3,000 up to $8,000, with most programs averaging around $7,000 per year. In Canada, all provinces have some method of providing student aid or student loans that can cover most, if not all, of your expenses for undergrad. I would highly recommend applying for student loans because oftentimes you are given grants along with a loan, and grants refer to money that you do not have to pay back, ever. Moving on, we have the MCAT. Everyone aiming for med school will be taking the MCAT. The cost of MCAT itself is around $320 and 430 Canadian dollars. However, the cost of study prep material can get quite expensive depending on how much help you end up needing. I've put a link down below in the description box that compiles all the free resources that you could use to study for your MCAT. And no, I did not come up with it myself, but it is quite comprehensive and extremely useful. My personal favorite of all of these that I used back in the day was khanacademy.com. Next up, we have the CASPer test. In Canada, there is a $40 base fee with additional $12 for every school that you send your results to. In the US, there is a base fee of around $85, but it also includes distribution of the results to 8 schools of your choice, and then each additional school costs around $15. Now, let's talk about Medschool Applications. In Canada, all provinces have their own costs associated with their application, as noted here. In the US, there is more of a standardized fee. When applying to MD schools, you go through MCAS, and the cost for your first application or your first school will be around $175, and then any additional school will cost you another $45 per school or program. Similar thing for DO schools. You apply through AACOMAS. The initial fee is slightly higher at $200 for the first school, but otherwise it's an additional $45 for any school or program that you add. Another thing to note for US schools is their system of secondary applications. These are applications that the schools send out once they've reviewed your initial application and would like to know more about you. To submit the secondary applications, it can cost anywhere from $30 up to $200, with most programs averaging out around $100 per application. Moving right along, once your interview invites start pouring in, you have to consider the cost of actually getting to your interview site. For example, if you end up getting an interview in Florida, but you actually live in Ontario, you bet there will be heavy expenses associated with most of your interviews like these. You have to consider travel costs, which could include flights and rental cars, and of course accommodation, so think of either hotels or Airbnbs, or if you're very lucky, you may be staying with family or friends in the area, which would be great. So you gave your interview, you thought it went really well, a few weeks or months later, you get a response, and congratulations, you've been accepted to medical school. Now, what kind of costs should you be expecting? In Canada, Medschool fees range anywhere from $5,000 up to $26,000 per year. In the US, costs are significantly higher, and you could be looking at $40,000 up to $100,000 per year. So, those were all the major costs that you should be thinking about on your journey to med school. Let's go over a summary of what this would look like if we were to add up all these costs. Let's go over Canada first. Say you are living in Ontario and you do a 4-year bachelor's degree, so that might cost you roughly $28,000 Canadian. And let's say you only used free resources to prepare for your MCAT. MCAT would be around $430. Let's also assume that you apply to all 6 Ontario schools, so your CASPer test would cost around $112, the actual applications would be around $1,000, and let's say your travel costs were minimal because you had your own car and stayed with family or friends for most of your interviews. And finally, you attended a 4-year med school program that cost you on the higher end around $100,000 for 4 years. So your total in this case, with all of these assumptions, would be around $130,000 to $150,000 for the entirety of your pre-med and your med school journey. On the other hand, if we look at the numbers for US schools, let's assume you did your undergrad in Canada, used free resources for MCAT prep, and have fairly similar costs for CASPer. Compared to the 6 Ontario schools, when applying to 6 US MD schools would cost you around $1,100 Canadian dollars. Then, if you're living in Canada, you will likely have major travel costs associated with all of your interviews. So let's put up a rough estimate of around $3,000 for 6 interviews, though I will say the cost can rise up here quite a bit. And then finally, your biggest costs will be the med school itself. If you look at the school with one of the cheaper tuitions, you may be looking at around 60,000 Canadian dollars per year, with a total of 240,000 for 4 years. In this case, with all of these assumptions, your total estimate is around 270,000 Canadian dollars. And I would remind you, this does not include any of your general living expenses at all. So, you may be wondering, since this is so expensive, just applying to and attending med school, how can anyone afford this? Well, loans will be your best friend throughout this journey. If you can pay out of pocket, that is fantastic. Otherwise, you would be relying on loans, either from the government or from the banks, as most students do. You can apply for student aid or student loan even if your med school is in the US. As for bank loans, for Canadian medical school, you can apply for loans for all of your expenses with no limits, with interest rate at prime, and without a need for cosigner. If, however, you're attending a US med school, you will still be able to secure a bank loan, but you'll need a cosigner, and the amount of loan that you will be getting will be dependent on their income, and you will have to shop around for the best interest rates. So, there you have it. I hope this video gave you a good overview of the costs as you think about medical school and progress through your journey. If you have any questions at all, please comment them down below, and as always, stay happy and healthy.